Hey, the title for this video is pretty self-explanatory, but just to quickly explain this video idea, I'm going to be ranking every player of Total Drama that didn't make the merge based on how I felt they played the game. This isn't a character ranking of how enjoyable I find them, because that would be a very different list, so don't expect certain people to be ranked super high just because they're loved by everybody. Tyler. I'm only including people on this list that have never made the merge in any season, meaning people like Beth and Justin are excluded because even though they didn't make the merge in Island, they did so in action. And even if I try to solely base it off just their Island game, I do think there would be some interference on my rankings based on what they did in their every season that they made the merge in. Out of the around 68 people that play Total Drama, 22 people meet that requirement and will be ranked in this video. And in that 22 people, there are 2 people from the new reboot seasons. Don't worry if you haven't seen them, I will give a considerable spoiler warning before I rank those 2, so if you haven't seen the reboot seasons and don't want any spoilers, then you can use the timestamps in the video to skip past this section to the next ranking. Future TD Wonder coming in here, you might have noticed that the thumbnail has a 1 on it and it's called part 1. It's because I did not actually get to ranking all 22 contestants here, so I only got through the first 11, and as a result I didn't end up talking about either of the reboot characters in this first part. So if you're even a little bit worried about spoilers, like you may actually catch them, you can watch this first part completely safe. I don't talk about either of them. Yeah, sorry, I broke up into 2 parts, I suck. I feel that this topic is pretty open-ended as to what is considered a good player, so to keep it hopefully a bit easier to understand and less biased on my part, I'm ranking these contestants on 3 factors which I consider to be the essentials to playing an elimination game like Total Drama. Strategic ability. How well you are planning your game. Do you have any targets and plans on how to get rid of them? Is your head in the game? Do you have creative ways to think of and potentially use your competition? Do you have a strategy that you effectively implement? For a grade A example of this, I lean to Heather's game in Island. The other parts of her game are a bit wonky, but it's very clear that she's always thinking of her next move and has many times where she has a target and implements a plan on how to get them eliminated. Next is sociability. Do you mix with people effectively? Do people like your presence? And are you able to keep the target off your back because of that? My peak example for this category is DJ. You could really include any of his 3 seasons because this is a guy who's played 3 times and none of the times he was eliminated was from people actually voting him out. All the times there were like auto eliminations or weird circumstances of him quitting or being the last person on a team and losing. He rarely got any votes during his game, and when he did, they were usually just because he was a bit of a challenge liability at times, but never because people didn't like him. He got a hug goodbye from Heather in Island. She hated everything with a pulse on that island, but she was sad to see DJ go, and that is peak work from his sociability. And lastly is challengeability. And I word it specifically like that because this isn't just physical strength. There are plenty of challenges that aren't physical strength related, so this category is more so to say, what's your range of talents and how useful are they in challenges? Are you a well-accumulated person of significant challenge feats? Can you help lead a team to work effectively in challenges? Do you think of crafty plans to help in challenges? My perfect, well, near perfect example for this is Alejandro, more so talking about his game in World Tour, because his work with Team Chris is very impressive. He motivated his team and led them to victory many times, and part of that was definitely involving team victory, being a complete train wreck, but for a team that was displayed as completely useless in their introduction, he turned them into a valid threat with his leadership skills, and also offered a wide range of useful challenge skills in the merge, with the only knock that could evade him having a perfect score is his eating challenge weakness, but that's actually it. I'll be ranking all these contestants on these factors from a 0 to 10, and their total is for the most part determining these rankings, with the only times they really aren't is like people have tied same total, then I come and like interpretively decide who I consider those 2 to be better and put them above them, but for the most part it's those numbers. I gave examples for all these categories to make these scores I'm about to give more contextualized, because the 3 people I just mentioned for their respective categories are the very top in those categories. They are 10 out of 10s or very close to them, and my point with that is that these players we're about to talk about mostly suck. I mean, they're premerge boots, so they clearly didn't do well at something, and most of these scores will probably not even be over a 5 and very rarely close to a 10. And now with that short explanation, let's begin. The moment that I'm doing fine, you guys are on my mind. These first 2 boots I'm about to talk about are in this sort of red tier because these are 2 players that I consider to very, very rarely ever make it far in the pre-merge, probably almost never make the merge. There would have to be very specific circumstances because they have a lot of flaws, and there was honestly a lot of people that I thought might be here originally with these scores, but they ended up just barely being this last person who was just 0.5 below the person in 21 and only 1 in their total from the person in 20, but in the very last ranking, considered, I guess, the worst player Total Drama is Stacy. I don't really know how much I can say about her game. She wasn't in it for very long. She was the first Premergers Island. She was only in one episode, and really all she did was just like never shut up about her ancestors, inventing things, being a pathological liar, really annoying her team, and ended up getting eliminated because of that. As for her scores, they're all very low expectedly. I mean, first we can talk about strategic ability. This is going to be kind of hard category to rank for a lot of these people. Strategy is something that we don't see used by a lot of people in Total Drama. Really, like when I think of strategy, there's like Alejandro, Heather, Courtney. Those are people who I consider to be like 9-10s, people who use a lot of strategy. But for a lot of people in Total Drama, they don't really talk about votes. They don't really talk about targets or specific strategies they have. So in theory, a lot of people would be very low and they'd be at like around 0. But to me, it's 0. Oh yeah, I guess I said 1 out of 10 earlier, but yeah, I'm actually going to also include 0 because there are sometimes I consider people to be that bad. But yeah, from a scale of 0 to 10, I consider 5 to be average. And if most people aren't at a 5, then 5 isn't really average anymore. So I'm pretty lenient when it comes to strategic ability, and I consider a 5 really just be, is your head in the game? Like, is your head in the game thinking about the game for most of the season? You know, you don't have to be leading every vote, but are you at least involved in most of those votes? You know, are you included on the vote? Or you're not left on the outs? Like that to me would get you a 5. And then, you know, going below that 5 would be your head wasn't in the game and you weren't included on the votes. You just weren't thinking or really caring about the game. And Stacy represents that pretty well because I gave her a 0 when it comes to her strategic ability. And it kind of sucks because Stacy only had one episode. Like, we don't know really what was going on in that brain. It's possible that she did have a plan or had strategies, but based on what we saw in her first episode, I highly doubt it. She never talked about the game. She never seemed focused on the challenge. She never seemed focused with her team. Literally, the only thing she ever did was talk about her ancestors, and that's not close enough for me to give her a higher ranking. Next, we'll talk about her challenge ability, and God, you know, I really should have just made examples for averages because this is also one I have to talk about a bit. Again, 5 to me is the average for a score. So when it comes to challenge ability, the simple way I put it is, if you are more of a hindrance, if you are more bad at challenges than you are good, you go below a 5. And if you are more good at challenges than you are bad, you go above a 5. Let me think of an example. Actually, Dave from Pakatu Island, because he is not like a challenge asset, really. He's not physically inclined, he's not really that clever, he's not a good leader. Like, he doesn't help his team win a challenge ever, I'm pretty sure. But the thing is, I wouldn't call him a hindrance. He never slowed down his team, he never showed a reluctance, he was always willing to do what he did, and he never was that slow at it. And that combined with his first merch challenge, which was a terrible episode when it comes to a lot of its other parts of his game. But when it comes to the challenge asset, he was able to down the drink in second place right behind Sugar, which Sugar is like considered a freak of nature when it comes to that because she's so disgusting. So Dave definitely had some like challenge, you know, innateness. Even though he wasn't really an asset and he was kind of weak, I don't think he was a hindrance. So he to me is a 5. Stacy to me is a 2.5. Again, we didn't really see a lot of her skills. I do think there are certain contexts where she could be helpful in a challenge, but I think those contexts are very rare. In Eventually Island, the season starts with Chris, like there's a scary noise in the forest and the entire cast has to run to Chris, and Stacy the last one to make it. So she's at least physically inclined, nor does she really seem to like have a lot going on in her head, so I don't really see her being like crafty or clever. Really, the only reason I give her a 2.5 is that when B was trying to use his what'd you call it, like a seesaw catapult launcher thing, basically whenever he tried to do that, Stacy didn't resist. That is the only reason I keep her at a 2.5, is that there's very select situations where I think her skills could be useful. Like, I think she could be a really good distraction if they ever need that, and she's compliant. You know, she isn't like difficult to work with, she isn't lazy or unwilling to help in a challenge like some other people might be in this list. So that is the only reason I give her a 2.5, which is still, you know, not a great score. And last, when we talk to social play, it's easily her biggest flaw. It's the reason she was eliminated. Again, I gotta talk about averages. I should have whatever, it's fine. 5 again is average to me. Definitely the hardest thing to rank because a lot of it is subjective. You could go over the objective meter of like, hey, do people like you? But Heather doesn't like a lot of people. But I wouldn't say you have bad sociability because Heather dislikes you. Like, that's not your fault that she's difficult to work with. So when it comes to sociability, it's like, do people dislike you for fault of your own? Like, are you doing something intentionally wrong? And most people would agree you are the issue. It's not a case of like, hey, these are really hard people to work with and it's not your fault. An automatic example that comes to mind is Ripper from the reboot seasons. Actually, I said there was going to be no reboot season spoilers. I guess this isn't a spoiler, but yeah, basically, Rupert very antagonistic. He's very intentionally antagonistic, and he rubs feathers with a lot of people who are considered to be pretty easygoing. So that's definitely a flaw in his sociability. There's other cases where, like, you know, say for example, Scott doesn't like Sam, but I wouldn't really blame Sam for that. Like, Scott doesn't like a lot of people. So, you know, we're gonna get into that later. As for Stacy, it's definitely her fault that people don't like her. She's definitely not a 5. She's well below the average mark of what I say normal social skills to work with a team would be. And I gave her a 1.5 only because I do think there are some people in the show that if she was put on the same team with them, that they could have a discussion. You know, like if Katie and Sadie were on the same season, sure, I could see them bonding, you know, like they're all very chatty, they're all very like peppy and talkative. And I also think maybe like if she was with someone like an Ella was really nice and she'd listen to all of Stacy's story and Stacy would feel a bit more validated, maybe she would tone it down a bit. Like I do think there's very select contexts where it could work, but for the most part it doesn't, which is why she's 1.5. Ask me what I wanted to be, and now I think the answer is plain C. I took a while on that first one, so I'm gonna try and go for the second one quicker. Yeah, it's Leonard. He's the second boot of Pakatu Island. God, what do I even say, dude? He acted like he was a wizard and he had wizard spells. He survived the first elimination on his team because they all decided to vote out Beardo instead because he was also very useless. So you could argue that Leonard should be a bit higher and Beardo should be in his place because he's a first boot, so that's, you know, objectively worse, but we'll get to Beardo a bit later. I do think he's a bit higher for a crucial reason, but Leonard to me is definitely at 21. We'll start with what I consider to be his worst factor so we can, you know, try to end on a bit of a high note. For me, it's the soul, and I wouldn't say soul, it's the big reason of why he got eliminated, and that's his challenge ability. He is so bad at challenges. He's definitely below average because he's not physically inclined, he's not clever or smart. All he does is get presented with a challenge and goes fireball and then hope something happen and never does. Now I do think, again, with like the way I was being generous with Stacy for sociability, I do think there's very select circumstances that Leonard could have skills that are very useful. For example, if he was in action and he was in the superhero challenge, I think he'd do pretty good at that because he'd be really good at making a character and an outfit and a backstory, but even then he wouldn't have been good at the obstacle course. Like I don't think there's a lot positive when it comes to Leonard, but I will say there are some circumstances where it could be useful. However, I gave him a 0.5 because even though there's a couple of circumstances I could see it being helpful, it's not enough for me to overlook the fact that he's so physically weak, he's so intelligently dumb, he's not crafty, he's not good at leading, and the biggest thing is the way I kind of hinted at with like Dakota and Topher and Amy, the way these people don't like to help in challenges because they're lazy. Leonard doesn't help in challenges because he doesn't do anything. Stubborn, and he's so firm by his belief that he's a wizard that he's actively not helping in challenges. Like he's not even attempting. If he was attempting or trying his best like Stacy was at least trying in the challenges she was in, then I probably could boost his challenge rating a bit, but the fact that he's so useless and he won't even be compliant, terrible for his game. Now I'll go to a bit of a higher point for him, which is his sociability score. When you think about his sociability, it's definitely rough around the edges. He's so weird and mystical, odd, and I think if we were talking on him any other season, he might be a 0. Like if Leonard was an island, he would have outcast himself so much. If he was in Revenge of the Island, he would have outcast himself so much. But because he's on this cast of weirdos, on paper, he didn't actually do that bad. By the time of his elimination, he did have a couple people who liked him. Ella liked him, Sugar liked him, like people on his team didn't like his personality, and we're kind of sad to see him go, which is not something I can say for a lot of these pre-merge boots because a lot of them isolate themselves a lot and have no friends and people who miss them when they're gone. But Leonard had people who were sad to see him go, and to me that is something. But again, he's such an outcast, he's such a weirdo, he definitely isolates himself, and nobody will look at Leonard and say, oh yeah, that guy's socially well adjusted. Nobody in the world will ever say that. So I still gave him a 2.5. You know, as being a bit generous, if it wasn't for the Ella and the Sugar stuff, you know, getting along with him a bit, he'd be more like a 1, but I decided to add on a 1.5 because those are pretty impressive things, at least in this list of people who are generally not good at the game. And last but not least, but pretty close to least, is his strategy. His fusing into rank. Now originally I had him pretty low. I also had him at like a 0.5 for this because his head is clearly not in the game. The only reason I even gave him a 0.5 is because he did at times, you know, seemed like being at elimination ceremonies and wanting to stay. And there were a couple times where, like, I think in the beginning of the second episode where he talked to his team and he's like, we have a chance to like turn this around and win this. Like he was kind of leading his team a bit. So, that's 0.5 is like a little bit showing his head in the game. But I did decide to boost it up a bit to 1.5. That's actually because of a very weird thing we see of him, where he was in the Redonkulous race. And I don't really know how to feel about that. I know I said earlier I don't include people who didn't make the merge one season and made the merge next season. But the Redonkulous race doesn't have a merge. And if it did have some sort of merge, he definitely didn't make it because he was the first boot in that season. So I did decide to include that into his factor. And Leonard's team, weirdly enough, did a really impressive thing in the second episode, was that he and Tammy, whoever, tried to make alliances with people. And that's a really impressive thing for a Redonkulous race, because people didn't start making alliances over teams till like far into that season. Not until at least episode 7, where teams starting to like cross-pollinate and talk about working together. But Leonard's team within 2 episodes is already talking about and working with people to go on a team. I think that's a really impressive display of strategy. Now, do I think it's like groundbreaking? No, not really. That's why I only brought it up a point. It didn't really end up working, and again, the cross-pollinating of teams didn't happen till later, but it did eventually happen. Like, other teams did think about it, they just didn't really implement it till later. So it's not like he was a revolutionist for his time. It was a crazy, ingenious strategy. It was just like kind of an impressive thing to show, hey, he actually kind of has a mind for the game. And I guess you could argue like, oh, it's the mind for the Redonkulous race game, not Total Drama. You're a nerd, shut up. All we're really banking here is like how good of a player they are. And I think if we see that, hey, he has a bit of those skills in that show, then it begs the reason he could have had some strategic ability. See, I'm giving him that, and his total in points was 4.5. Next we go into a bit of like this dark orange tier. I don't really know what I consider this area. I'd probably define it as where red tier is like, you are very unlikely to make the merge. You're very unlikely to make it far. Orange tier is like, could see it. Like, it's possible. There's some element to you where I think you could make it far in the game, or you could at least make the merge. I think that's the thing. Like, you could potentially make the merge, but it's also pretty unlikely the way you played. So to start off this dark orange area at number 20, I have the only person to ever be booted first in 2 seasons. It's Ezekiel. We have 2 very lackluster, interesting games to talk about here. So in his first season, I don't actually think he did that bad. He didn't show much of a strategic mind. He kind of seemed like an airhead. He was socially awkward, so his social ability wasn't very high. But he did have some like physical challenged usefulness in that first challenge. He showed an extreme willingness to do dangerous things. He showed a very cooperative mind, and I think those are things that you could have at least, kept him around 5 for. You can obviously hinder him a lot in sociability for a comment he made that got him to be eliminated in that episode. However, I don't blame Ezekiel for that comment, really, because it wasn't a fault in his character or personality, because he didn't actually believe what he said. He didn't believe that comment that women were weaker. He was told that comment by his dad, and he just, regurgitated it at a bad time. But I don't blame his innate sociability as a player super heavily on that comment, because he didn't know what he was saying. And I just think if he got past that comment and he grew and people saw, oh no, he doesn't believe that, he was just taught bad values, then he could have very easily rebounded from that. I mean, it's definitely a knock on his sociability, but it's not a super big knock. Like, I still would have kept his sociability around like 3, maybe 3.5 after his first season, but his second season performance in World Tour, really, it destroys, I think, the few good things that Ezekiel had in his first one. He comes off super arrogant, he doesn't make any friends, his sociability drops down because now he's actually being an asshole and people aren't liking or respecting him for it, and people don't want to be around him. His challenge ability goes down because he becomes less compliant, and the few times he does kind of become compliant are ways which he completely messes up by feeding his team sticks to their crock. So he just messes up in the challenge, he messes up his sociability, and the only thing that really goes up from that second season is the strategic ability, because even though we didn't see him implement any strategy, he definitely seemed, more in the game. His head was more in the game, he was more devoted to the game. That's the only thing that went up from the first season. But the sociability and the challenge ability both dropped for me, so let's get into that. His sociability score is a 1.5. Again, after the first season, I would have considered him around a 3. I don't think good, but I don't think he was completely horrendous. But after that performance in season 1, and then the arrogance he showed in season 2, isolating himself from everybody on his team and in his cast, and even Chris himself by getting himself, eliminated before the show started, which isn't really fair or allowed, but he did do that because of how bad his social game was. And the 1.5 is tough. I didn't see him as like a 0. I think there's like a little aspect of sympathy you could have for him. And kind of like Stacy, who was also a 1.5 in sociability, I think there are circumstances where people would help him, where people would feel bad for him. So I think it's also really obvious to see that his arrogance in season 2 is also, like not really him. It was the fame obsessing and corrupting a very impressionable mind, kind of like how, Jeff got fame obsessed in action. That's what I view the situation of Ezekiel as. I don't think the arrogance is part of his character, who he really is. He just kind of, again, got implemented with bad ideas, cleared up those notions and stopped acting so arrogant. He would have done pretty well socially, so give him 1.5 for that. Challenge ability is kind of rough. I think he definitely wasn't terrible if we're looking at select aspects. Again, in season 1, he was very fearless, he was pliant, and in season 2, he showed to be really crafty, because after he got thrown off the airplane the first time by Chris, he went into the landing gear and then got back in the challenge and, got himself covered up in mummy bandages so that the opposition would take him to the end. But I don't really know if that was a challenge thing that he was actually thinking about. I think it was just kind of luck. But I also think there's the big time where he fails being a challenge asset, which was obviously to the first elimination episode in Team Victory, where he got his team to lose in a round that wasn't even supposed to be an elimination, which was pretty bad. Again, after first season, I would have considered him around a 5. Not a super helpful asset, but he was something. After the shenanigans he pulled in season 3, I dropped him down considerably to a 3 when it comes to his challenge score. And when it comes to a strategic score, after season 1, I would have considered it a 0. He clearly was not in the game at all. He clearly didn't even care about the game that much. It seemed like he was just kind of on the show by a happenstance. I really don't know how he got there or why he was there. He clearly wasn't thinking about the game, but he was thinking about the game when he came back the second time. The issue is that he wasn't thinking about the game in a good way. He was thinking of the game, his head was in the game, he wanted to play the game, he was excited to play the game, but he was playing it badly. He wasn't doing a good job at being a part of the game. He wasn't doing anything right. Even when he talks in his very, arrogant, macho manner in season 3, none of it is ever I'm a genius strategist. All of it's I'm super strong and quick and better. There's none of the things of actually I'm a strategist, I'm a genius. I think maybe he says smarter at one point, but it seems very evident that that's not really what he was really going for. So I ended up landing on a score of just 1, because even though his head was in the game, and you could argue a bit higher for that, maybe a 2 or a 3, he was just doing it all wrong, especially considering that in his first season. I think 1 is definitely where I land. Again, season 1 it was a 0, season 3 it was probably around a 2, so I averaged it out to about a 1.5, which gives him a total of 5.5. Next, at the number 19 spot, we have, I guess I should actually pull up both of them, shouldn't I? We have, Sadie and Katie. Yeah, they are not good. Their scores are actually the exact same to me, because they are carbon copies of each other. So when I talk about their points here, it's going to apply for both of them. First off, let's get the easy one out of the way. Their strategic ability. They never fought at the game. It really just kind of felt like they were falling for the game. They didn't seem to care about the game at all when they were both there. And then Sadie just, kind of faded into the background and didn't think about the game at all once Katie got eliminated. The only point of contention I slightly hesitated on was Ezekiel's first round elimination, because Katie and Sadie are shown to be looking off to the side of a smirk, showing that they clearly voted for Ezekiel and they were part of that plan. But the thing is, it wasn't a strategic plan. It wasn't a strategy for them to do that, and they weren't a part of a genius vote. It was just the natural implication of what you should do when somebody makes themselves that much of a social outcast. I don't think there was really any strategy in that thought. So yeah, I give them both 0s. I think their heads were never in the game. I don't think they ever fought or cared about the money in the island special where they were chasing the briefcase. They just started fighting again and not caring at all. When it comes to their sociability, they're actually ranked the highest of anybody we've talked about so far, which still isn't very high. I give both of them a 3 when it comes to their sociability. They're one where I consider them, they have cons and pros. It's not like they're going one way only. I do think there are pros to the way they socialize, if they socialize with other people the way they socialize with each other. But they don't really talk to other people that much, and when they talk to each other, they annoy the shit out of their team because they wouldn't ever shut up. And again, as I said before, they didn't talk to anybody else whose name wasn't Katie or Sadie. They weren't really involved in that sociability, and I guess you'd knock that more so for Sadie than Katie, because you don't know, maybe if Sadie got eliminated first, then Katie would have talked to people more. I doubt it. They seem so similar to each other. I have a hard time believing that Katie would have actually taken that step. Maybe she would have, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I don't consider them to be good socialists, so again, below average, but I do give them a 3 because I don't think it was that bad. I definitely think there's worse ways you could have the sociability, and even though people were annoyed by how much they chitter-chattered, Duncan was annoyed, Harold was a bit annoyed, Courtney was annoyed, they were never so mad at Katie or Sadie for being so chatty that they were we have to eliminate them. They were just you guys guys should shut up. You know, like, it wasn't a case of you guys are so annoying, we have to get rid of you. Like, they weren't eliminated because they were doing poor socially. They were eliminated because they blew the challenge. Speaking of which, let's talk about their challenge score. I actually also put it at a 3, which might actually be a bit too high looking at it in retrospect. But again, a 5 to me is average. I consider them below average because they blew the challenge in Katie's elimination episode by not listening to the team and wandering off and getting lost. And then Sadie kind of made an enemy in the challenge with her elimination episode by not listening to Courtney when she told him to stop, so she wasn't very compliant and easy to work with in that challenge. But I also think that was a bit of a plot device, so I don't knock Sadie that much for that because that was just, you know, a dumb thing they did to get Sadie eliminated. So I don't necessarily care about that all that much. Kind of like how I view with Leonard. I put them at 3 because I think there are times where their skills could come in handy. I don't remember what Ricky I read this on. I think it stated that they sewed and made their own outfit. So if there was ever a fashion challenge where they had to make an outfit, they'd be really good at that. If they ever, and even when they do challenges that are very sociable settings, like when Sadie was working with Lindsay in her Face the Fear challenge, she was one of the few people in her team to overcome her fear with the help of Lindsay. The social bonds and challenges, I think they'll both be very good at. And considering they were pretty compliant for the most part, I also think that's a big help because even in their elimination episode, they weren't intentionally, you know, not listening. They were just dumb and got distracted. So I think 3 for challenge score might be a bit generous, but it's what I ended up landing on. And because they had a 3 in challenge and 3 in sociability and 0 in strategy, that leaves them both with a total of 6. I do think I'd put Katie slightly above Sadie on this list, you know, as number 18, solely because she got eliminated sooner. So even though to me, I view these two as carbon copies, and I don't think Katie would actually realistically do more if she stayed longer or stayed in place of Sadie, there's the argument they made, like, potentially maybe she could, and with Sadie we know she definitely wouldn't. Literally a sliver of a tiny bit more to me. They're basically on the same field, but just for the sake of ranking and numbering these people, I'd put Katie slightly above. Next at number 17 is the third boot of Pakatu Island, Rodney. There is no easy way to sugarcoat this. Rodney is only here because of his challenge prospects. So I guess we'll talk about that score first. For his challenge ability, I gave him a 6. You know, I do consider him to be a bit above average. He's definitely a very strong and physical and healthy young chap that could have been a very helpful asset when it comes to any sort of strength challenge. And he's also very compliant with his team. You know, he was very helpful and took orders very well. And I do think he was lacking a bit in some other fields, which is why he's only a 6. You know, he's not like a 7 or an 8. He's not quite there. You know, he's definitely missing some things, and he cost his team the challenge he was eliminated in. But I don't knock him too much for that, just because it was such a specific challenge that was like, it almost feels like it was catered for him to be bad at. And I guess it was, because the writers probably made that challenge for Rodney to lose at. Also, I just realized I called him the third boot. He was actually the 4th boot. Yeah, I always forget Amy was eliminated before him, but whatever. He was an early boot, you get the point. Anyways, that's his challenge score out of the way. Now let's get to the fun stuff. First, we'll talk about his strategy, I guess. His strategy is a 0. He was never, for even a second, thinking about the game. His mind was constantly on girls. His mind was constantly on this new crush of the hour. He was never thinking about the game. Even when it came to voting out Sammy, which, you know, was the one round he survived, it was basically spoon-fed to him by their team. Like, he didn't think or come up to that solution himself. The entire team was like, we should get rid of Sammy. And then Rodney just piggybacked off that. He didn't actually use any brain power there. I didn't even care. Again, like, the only thing he cared about was his crushes. His head was very evidently not in the game. And I can't justify giving him any sort of strategic score when he was so aloof the entire time. And when it comes to his sociability, it's not that much of a different story. I gave him 0.5. He's so terrible at making friends. So socially awkward. He's like Ezekiel in the first season. He's so socially inept. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's been grown up on his farm his entire life. But where him and Ezekiel differ is, again, like Ezekiel on Island, he just didn't know. He made a mistake. He was taught a bad thing. Rodney, I guess you could also say, doesn't know, but I do think it's more so to his character. No one taught him to be like this. It's just like the way he is. And he had a lot more episodes to try and fix it, and he didn't. And that's more so where the issues come from there, and why I give him an even lower social ability ranking. He makes his team uncomfortable. He makes all the females uncomfortable. He like constantly talks to people and then stutters a ton because his crush is there, and he's like, oh, he's so bad at social ability. 0.5 for social, 0 for strategy, and 6 for challenge. The only reason he is here with a total of 6.5 above Katie and Sadie with their total of 6 is because of his challenge ability. If it wasn't for his challenge ability, he honestly could be ranked like the lowest player of all time if it wasn't for his challenge ability, because he has a 0 and a 0.5 in the other fields. Like, he's very bad at those parts, and the only reason he can even make it here, which isn't even that high on the list, is because of his challenge ability. So, you know, I guess it's kind of impressive in that regard. I think it's also more so exemplifying how bad these people are, that one person going above average in the ranking in one one field is enough to go over all these people below him. So I don't know, take it how you will. Let's move on. Next we have number 16 and the last person in the dark orange area. It is the first boot of Pakatua Island. It is Beardo. I feel like I should probably explain why he's here, because he's a first boot and the two people who were first boots on the other seasons are here at the bottom free. So it should go to argue that he should probably be a bit lower, especially lower than these people like Haiti and Sadie and Rodney. You know, they're all bad. They did make it further than Beardo by a good amount. And a good way to start the discussion is talking about his sociability score. I definitely consider him to be below 5. All he did in that first episode was make random noises, and it definitely didn't appeal to anybody. Nobody liked what he did. They were just kind of weirded out by the fact that he wouldn't talk and all he did was make noises. And he also kind of like made an enemy out of Sugar for like making a fart noise when she sat down and she was insulted by it. Again, kind of a thing I said earlier of sociability. Sugar is a very difficult person to get to like you, but I do think that was a case, at least in his circumstance, where he antagonized her, so that's a fault to his sociability. But with all that being said, I still have a sociability out of 3, and that's for one big reason: his audition tape. In his audition tape, he states that he is shy, and that the reason he makes a bunch of random jukebox noises in the first episode was because he was shy. That makes it a bit hard to rank his sociability, because we didn't really see Beardo. We saw this guarded off, shy, scared version of Beardo, but we don't really know what he would have been like if he just talked to people. Based on what I saw in the audition tape, he seemed like a very calm, move speaker. He didn't seem to like have a bunch of issues with being himself. He didn't seem like someone who'd be combative. He didn't seem like someone who would brush on people's favors. I do think in a world where he got over his shyness, which mind you would be pretty hard considering he'd just make noises for like the first, I don't know, 4 episodes or up until he makes a friend. Like, it would be hard for him to get to that point where he could just be himself. But I do think if he was able to show off his authentic self, I think he could do pretty well in a season, which is why I have him up here and why I have his sociability pretty high for a guy who just made random jukebox noises. If his audition tape didn't exist and I just had to assume all he does is make jukebox noises, he'd probably be like a 0. Like, there's nothing to infer there of how he could possibly make a bond with anybody just making noises. Because of that tidbit of him being shy and the way he spoke in his audition tape and the way he seemed very thoughtful and caring, I do think there's in a world where he could be very sociable. But again, below average, and it seems either way, you know, he has difficulty speaking to people. So knock to sociability. Next, we're going to talk about his strategy. I put it at 1.5. Based on what we saw in the game, he definitely didn't have a mind for the game, really. I think he's one of the people the most, you could say, maybe cared more than he let on. If we let him stay a bit longer, he could be involved in these votes and stuff. But I just have a hard time realistically seeing it. He doesn't seem like someone who's very scheming or intuitive. Again, in his audition tape, he came off as very genuine, and usually very genuine people aren't very strategic or very involved in the game. You know, they're usually there for the connections on the island. They're not there to like win. That doesn't bode well for his strategy. But again, I give him that 1.5, which is still low, but it's because he could be a part of it to see that being possible. And last, we'll talk about his challenge ability. I gave him a 2.5. I think what we saw in the first episode was very unimpressive. The first part of the first challenge was like teams had to go to a junk pile and grab stuff to make their shelter with while Chef was shooting tennis balls at them with a tennis ball launcher. Beardo decided to do a slow-mo run, which is a character funny thing, but not a very helpful challenge thing. And then he gets hit in the nuts, and then that's it. Then he doesn't really help with the creative aspect, actually building the shelter. I guess you could say maybe like help the construction, because he seems like, you know, a bigger guy. He probably could have helped like lift the stones and stuff, but it's kind of a stretch. So I lean more on a 2.5. And the reason why it's a 2.5 as opposed to like a 1 is mostly just because his sound box sings. His ability to make a bunch of random sounds could be useful in certain settings. Could be made it further, could be used to distract the other team, or could be used in like a talent show probably. But again, even when I just listed off like that, there's not a ton of circumstances which could be used. So yeah, 2.5 feels fair, and Beardo is left with a total of 7, which is just 0.5 above Rodney. Good for Beardo, I suppose. At number 15, we hit our first contestant going into this yellowish orange area, which I define with these characters as people who I think played a bad game, but it was mostly because of one part of their game, and if they fixed that part specifically, then they could have actually played a decent game. Maybe not like win or make it super far in the merge, but I do think all these people I'm about to talk about could have probably made the merge if they changed this one aspect of their game that really sucked. That really isn't as evident with this first person we're about to talk about, number 15, which is Dakota. Just to get this out of the way, we are obviously not going to talk about her as Dakota Zord, because that's kind of on unfair to factor her physical score into a mutant creature when comparing it to a bunch of other teenagers. Like, that's just blatantly unfair. And if she was a mutant, before getting brought back, then she probably wouldn't have been brought back, because Chris would be like, a mutant competitor is unfair in a challenge aspect. So I'm not going to include her challenge ability score into what she was as Dakota Zord, but I will include a bit of like the stuff she did beforehand as Dakota Zord into her game score. As for an example like that, we're going to start with her strategic ability. Originally in her first 2 rounds, this was really low. She never fought of the game. That's actually the reason she got voted out the first time, because she wasn't thinking about the game and her team was annoyed that she blew the challenge because she wasn't taking the game seriously. And she didn't even come to the game to win. She came here solely just to get fame. So if we were just talking about those first 2 episodes, it'd probably be 0.5, somewhere around there. But I actually brought her score up a lot on her second go around. She did a really impressive thing when she came back, and it was that she actually took the game seriously. She was like, I'm back now, I might as well try to take advantage of this opportunity. And she ended up actually implementing a pretty good strategy of talking with and planning on working with Zoe, which is someone she quickly identified as very nice, always taking in new friends, and Dakota recognized all that very early. And more importantly, she didn't actually do that bad of a job at it, which I think is a big thing to talk about here, because even with the people I mentioned before, of someone like, Ezekiel, who had a mind for the game and started to think of the game a bit more, he didn't actually do anything well. That's why he did pretty bad. But Dakota identified a good person to work with and started to actually make pretty good progress in that first minute they talked. The issue is that it then all kind of fell apart because she became a mutant, became intimidating to Zoe, and then started to brush Zoe the wrong way. But that wasn't even Dakota's fault. It's not her fault she became a mutant creature, and if she hadn't become a mutant creature, I actually think she could have created a pretty decent bond with Zoe. Do I think it would have been enough to save her? Probably not, because she already had a closer bond to Scott, and she already had a closer bond to Mike and Cameron, so she probably would have ended up voting out Dakota anyways if they lost and Dakota didn't become a mutant. But there's also wonky stuff in that challenge itself if she didn't become a mutant, because then they probably wouldn't have gone for the swamp, and they did go into the swamp, then they would have had to get past the crocodile a different way, and even if they did get past the crocodile, then they would have had to get past the thorn burst, which wouldn't have been possible without Dakota throwing the crocodile in the thorn burst. A lot of different wonky things would have happened there already, so maybe she could have made it to the merge if she didn't become a mutant. I don't know, it's hard to tell. From what we saw of Zoe, which I find really impressive, because she identified the right person. She identified a person who would have worked with her. The only reason it really fell through is because of things out of her control, like turning into a mutant. So I actually gave her a strategy score of 2.5. It's still not great, 5's average, 2.5 below the average, but it is a lot better than what we saw in those first 2 episodes. Next, let's jump into her challenge ability. Not great. She does not have a lot going on. Again, in those first 2 episodes, she really didn't care or help out in the challenge at all. In the first episode, she isn't physically inclined, and she was also reluctant to B's plan because she just wanted to stay and take paparazzi photos. She almost cost her team the challenge there. She didn't know how to use a saw on a rope. She used the wrong side of no teeth. That shows that she's pretty dumb and not good at being clever and innovative in challenges. In the second episode, she just didn't try and got eliminated for not trying at all. So I gave her a challenge ability score of 2.5. And most of that, again, is kind of the stuff of Katie and Sadie, where she would be really good in a fashion challenge. And there was a fashion challenge in this season. So, she could have been really helpful in a challenge like that. And I also think on her return, she definitely seemed a lot more willing to help in challenges, which is difficult to envision because we only saw her compete as the transformation of Dakota Zord mutant in that episode. But I do think even had she not turned into a mutant, she would have tried to help more in challenges. Kind of nullifies a bit of her early game, apprehension and helping in challenges. 2.5 feels pretty reasonable. I think there's areas where she could be helpful in a challenge, but for the most part, she's not very smart, she's not very strong, and we mostly saw her as someone who was apprehensive. So even though, in her return, she became more willing, she's still mostly apprehensive. And lastly, we'll talk about her sociability, which is her highest score, but not by a lot. Dakota is someone, when you look at her archetype, you would assume is a very sociable person, but she's not. She didn't talk to her team at all. She basically ignored them the entire time. The only person she talked to in any meaningful capacity was Sam, and that wasn't her talking to Sam, that was Sam talking to her. I do think if she was a bit more involved in the game and went out of her way to talk with people more, she could have had a pretty good social score. I could definitely see her naturally at a 6, because she seems very involved in social life. She seems like someone who uses a lot of social media. She seems like someone who talks to a lot of people. She definitely seems like a social butterfly. Had she taken that step to talk to her teammates, she could have maybe not created super tight bonds, but I do think she could have created a lot of bonds. But I can't base her sociability off of what could have been. I have to base it off of what was, and what was is that she did not talk to a lot of people. So her sociability is below average. At a free, again, I give her that free because I do think she has social skills, could have made social bonds, but she didn't, leaving her with a total of 8 points, which is 1 above Beardo. At number 14, we have the second boo of her season, Eva. I know I said at the beginning of this video that I won't include people who, ended up making the merge, but Eva doesn't count to me because even though she did make the merge, it's because she was brought back and then got eliminated in that same exact episode she was brought back. So it's not like she has a lot of merge experience that would interfere with her ranking. She has basically the same amount of information on her gameplay strategy she does from her first 2 episodes. It's not enough for me to exclude her from this ranking. Eva is kind of similar to Rodney here, where she really sucks in 2 categories, but she gets pushed this far because of her really impressive performance in the other one. And you can probably assume which category that is, so let's just talk about her first. Her challenge ability. She is inhumanely strong for a teenager. We see her turn the Sasquatchernaqua, which I believe is the canonical name. I know it's dumb, but we see her turn that into a fur coat within 10 seconds of being in the same crate as it. She gets to the final 2 of the first merge challenge and only ends up losing because Lashana succeeded her dare to eliminate her instead of Eva actually failing her dare. We don't see any weaknesses from her in the first 2 episodes. She makes it pretty far in the sleep challenge. She carries the crates in the first challenge like they're nothing. Definitely see her as an above average challenge ability score at 7. And the only reason I can't go much higher than a 7 is because her physical strength, while very impressive, is really all we see, and we do only see her compete in free challenges. And as I said at the beginning of this video, not every challenge is physical ability, and I don't think Eva would be very helpful in any sort of other challenge that requires intelligent mind. I don't think she's very crafty, I don't think she has any talent outside of being strong. I also think her temper would make her a bit of a difficult person to work with, especially on a team. We can see that in the first episode where she's very snappy with Courtney, and she's very snappy with her team for not working. So even though she's really strong, I don't view her as a good collaborator. So I can only put her at 7, which again isn't bad, especially on this list. A lot of people don't reach 7 on a lot of things on this list. Next, we're going to talk about her strategic ability. She's kind of like an Ezekiel in a sense where she doesn't show a lot of strategic mind on her first 2 rounds, but on her return at the merge, she actually shows some game awareness of realizing the Bass voted her out and wanting to target and not work with them. The issue is she has the brain to understand what happened and what she should do, but she does it wrong, where she targets Bridget, which is probably one of, if not the most liked person on the Bass, at least at that point early into the merge. Bridget made a lot of strong connection with the girls, and Eva kind of quickly isolates herself by antagonizing Bridget in the cabins, making all the girls mad at her, which is terrible strategic play, not only because it isolates herself, but because it doesn't make any sense for her to solely target Bridget for what happened when other people from the Bass are still there and are arguably a lot more responsible for her going home. So even though she returns and shows some game awareness, which does bring her up some points, might I add, if you're only including her first 2 episodes, she'd probably be only a 0.5 when it comes to strategic ability. Because we see she did have some gameplay in her mind on her return, but it was the wrong idea, I still view her as below average at 1.5. And my favorite score to talk about with Eva, her sociability. Our first 0 for sociability. Do I even have to explain it? She's so antagonistic, her anger issues are way out of control, and whereas with other people with low sociability, it's mostly hey, you're not good at making bonds, Eva has a 0 in sociability because she makes enemies. Even Rodney is someone who I gave a 0.5 in sociability. He's weird and he makes a lot of people thrown off, but he doesn't actively or at least intentionally antagonize people, whereas Eva does. Her anger issues lead her to outcast herself so early. A lot of people on this list end up outcasting themselves, that's why they got voted out, but I give Eva even more grief for that because like I said, she has an inhuman amount of physical strength for a teenager, so she shouldn't have been voted out this early, especially when the Bass just lost 2 back-to-back challenges. They really should have wanted to keep challenge strength, but Eva was so bad socially that people were willing to let her go because she was so unhinged. That is terrible social play, and like I said on her return, she instantly antagonizes Bridget and makes herself a public enemy. There's not a single high or good point of Eva's sociability. With 7 in challenge ability, 1.5 in strategic ability, and 0 in sociability, she has a total of 8.5. At number 13, we have the Chris superfan wannabe, Topher. In theory, Topher should be pretty high because he's one of the only few people on this list who is the person eliminated right before the merge. He wasn't an early boot. He wasn't in the first 4 or 5 boots. I don't remember actually what number he is. I think it's 7. We're gonna go with 7. Ideally, someone like him should be pretty high up in this list because he made it over a good amount of people here. He made it above Ella, Same, Amy, Dawn, B, Sam, I'm pretty sure Brick, and I think he tied with Hannah Maria. Noah and Tyler kind of weird cases where their merge happened really late into their seasons, but still, from a numbers aspect, Topher should be above a lot of these people, but he's not because I don't consider him to be average any parts of the game. Strategic ability is something that you'd think maybe Topher would be good at. Looking at his archetype, he's like a Sierra, he's a super fan, he knows a lot about the game, he should be really inclined in that part. The issue is that he is not for 1 second ever really thinking about the game. He's only thinking about how he can steal the job from Chris. He's never actually thinking about votes or allies or targets or who he wants to work with. He's only ever thinking about Chris, and the fact that he is the elimination before the merge, and I can't point to a single person he ever even had a remote connection to, is really bad. It shows how absent-minded he was in the gameplay, and I give him a 1.5. And I personally believe I'm being way too kind with that 1.5, because again, he wasn't ever thinking about the game. I'm ever so graceful with that 1.5, because he was, technically thinking about the game. He just wasn't thinking about the aspects that I ideally wanted to be thinking about. His sociability, for the most part, is actually not too bad. I mean, again, his sociability is in the context of, like, Leonard, where if you put him on any other season, he'd be viewed as a weirdo and wouldn't have a very good sociability. Like, again, he's a Sierra in the superfan archetype, and Sierra was not viewed socially sound. And I do think Topher is more socially sound than Sierra. You really wouldn't expect him to be good at talking to people because he's so obsessive over the show and Chris. But I don't see any flaws in his social game before his elimination episode. He's pretty general, middle of the road. I don't think he takes the extra step to create any strong social bonds for anybody, like I said, for his strategic ability, but I also don't think he makes an enemy out of anybody. I don't think he upsets or annoys anybody. Nobody is like really ever super mad at Topher, and maybe they get annoyed for a bit, but they get annoyed for like a minute and then get over it. It's never bad enough that Topher's put on the chopping block. His elimination episode still exists, and I think that's really when you can start to see that Topher doesn't have any strong bonds, and I would put that elimination more so onto his mind being outside of the game, which is strategic score, but his social game definitely wasn't good in that moment. And it dropped me down a good bit because, actually saying it, I don't think he would have been a 5 before all that. He probably would have been like 4.5 because he did still brush people around gray. Then also factoring in his elimination episode, just not even including the end part of the challenge where he blows it. He's just like the entire challenge trying to show off to the producers, and his team's just like, what the hell are you doing? You're so annoying. So I gave him a sociability score of 3.5. Lastly, let's go into his challenge ability. He's also kind of below average to me in challenge ability. He's really not remarkable in any sense. He's not a physical asset, especially later into the pre-merge. We see how like resistant and difficult he can be after he gets Chris's phone. He does, however, have a couple interesting talents. He was good at balancing things on his head. He has a really good like camera and stage presence, which I think could have helped in like creative performing challenges, and it also helped him work with his team very well, before getting Chris's phone, because he was really good at listening and helping people like Jasmine, and also identifying them as the strong people on his team, which I think actually in a way you can credit to is, well, he realized like, hey, I'm not good at this, so the smart thing for me to do as a challenge competitor is to step back and let people who know what they're doing do what they do. You could argue it was also him being lazy, but it wasn't lazy in a way that actually like damaged his team. Like when he had to help in a challenge, he would do it until he got Chris's phone, which is really what hurt his score, because if we were considering everything before he got Chris's phone, he'd be like a 5. He was an extremely helpful challenge asset, but he wasn't hindering his team in any way. Like there wasn't any point where he actively cost his team a challenge, but then he did actively cost his team a challenge. Give him a challenge ability score of 4, leaving him with a total of 9. At number 12, we have the other person from Pacateo Island, eliminated before Topher. We have Ella. Ella actually doesn't play that bad of a game, which is why she kind of finds herself near the top of this yellow tier, because I do think had a couple things gone differently, Ella could have made it far. Not even to mention the fact that she didn't get voted out. Her team didn't eliminate her for doing anything wrong. Chris removed her because he was like, a little whiny baby about the singing because he didn't like it. Granted, I do think had the team lost, Sugar would have gone before Ella, but then Ella probably would have gone after that because Sean, Dave, and Sky are really close. He really wasn't as well integrated into that, which naturally leads me into the first score we'll talk about for her, which is her sociability. Again, Topher, like Leonard, any other season, she'd be viewed as a weirdo and get herself on the outs for being so odd. Because she was on Pacatero Island, I don't actually think her sociability was too bad. Sugar obviously didn't like Ella, though Sugar is a really weird person and like a lot of people, so I don't blame her too much for that. Dave and Sean were both people who were lightly annoyed of Ella at points, but for the most part, they didn't hate her or anything, and I actually think her and Sky had a really good relationship. I wouldn't call it like airtight, but we see a lot of small moments with her and Sky. Sky is helping out Ella from Sugar, Sky is talking of Ella. Like, I do think they have a pretty decent bond, but like I said with Sugar, Dave, and Sean, she doesn't have any what I would consider good connections outside of Sky. Her connection with Dave and Sean I would consider like neutral, maybe slightly above neutral, but I wouldn't call it good. I do view Ella's game as just slightly below in sociability, but I do think had she made the merge or had she been with other people in the show like Dawn, I could definitely see him getting along with their shared love of animals. She could definitely get along with someone like Sammy because of how kind she is and how kind Sammy is. I certainly believe that Ella could have created strong bonds with people if she was put on the right team with those people, but from what we saw in her season, she failed at doing that, so I view her for sociability score of 4. Strategically, she did not think of the game at all, she did not think of votes at all, she did not think of targets. I really get the impression from Ella that she didn't even care about the game. Like, she wouldn't really care that she got voted out. We see in the original she didn't even really care that she got voted out because she, quote, couldn't continue to hang out with these amazing people. She did not think of the game in any capacity. I think she was rarely ever a part of like the right vote. If we look at the people who were eliminated before her on her team, it was Beardo, which I'm not sure if she even voted for Beardo. I assume she did because I don't know who she would have voted in place of that, but again, that's not a strategic vote. Beardo outcasted himself. Same thing with Leonard. He blew a challenge, and I'm also not even sure if Ella voted Leonard, so I don't think it shocks anybody too much when I say her strategic score is 0. Lastly, we're going to talk about her challenge score. I do view as slightly above average, mostly because her ability to sing and pacify animals is a really helpful asset. We see it at multiple points in the pre-merge, lead her team to victory in a way. When you think of the dueling sticks water challenge, she got a point for her team by being able to pacify the bear. When you think of her elimination episode challenge, she was able to bring the bear with the corn in it all the way to the vending machine due to her singing ability. In the second episode, when she was working with her hog, she sung to pacify the hog and got past the obstacle course pretty quickly because of that. Like, her ability to sing was a really helpful challenge asset. The issue is that she also becomes a bit aloof during challenges, and her head just isn't always in the game when it comes to challenges. Like I mentioned with the episode 2 challenge of pacifying the hog, she did get past the obstacle course quickly because of it, but she also wasted a good amount of time dancing with the pig because she wasn't fully thinking of the challenge. In Rodney's elimination episode, the tiebreaker where her and Rodney had to like undo the bag that was holding the buzzer to the other team's collar, Ella wasn't going to press the button. In fact, I don't think she would have ever pressed that button because it meant inflicting harm on the other team, and she's so nice that becomes a challenge hindrance when it comes to hurting the other team because she would never do it. And if that chicken didn't take the buzzer out of her hand, Rodney would have probably eventually gotten his team's buzzer, buzzed Ella's team, and then Ella would have got eliminated for blowing the challenge for being too nice. So even though she has a really impressive and really useful skill, her head just isn't in the game when it comes to challenges, and it makes her a bit difficult to work with, a bit absent-minded in the challenges, which I consider pretty bad for her challenge ability. And outside of her singing, she doesn't show to have anything else. She doesn't show to have physical strength, clever, or crafty. So what I would have considered as a 6 in her challenge ability when it comes to just her singing, I brought down to a 5.5 because of her weakness of staying focused on the goal, leaving her with a total of 9.5. That is the end of part 1. This has been a really interesting video for me to make. I hope you've not been bored by it. I never really try to talk about characters' gameplay. It's such a weird subjective thing to rank in a cartoon where everything's scripted. Like, characters only do well or bad really based on the metric of what writers want. It's hard to say, hey, these people are good because the writers wrote all their plans to work, and this person's bad because the writers wrote all their plans to not work. Like, it's really not a fair system, and it's nothing I ever really thought of ever taking seriously, which is why I did this video where it's all pre-merge players, all players that are, you know, pretty terrible, because I don't really have to care too much about who I say is good and who I say is bad, because it's not like I'm ranking like the best of the best, like the Heavers and the Alejandros and the Courtneys and the Duncans, like among those people who is the best. But I just find it fun to talk about all these objectively terrible games. I don't get to talk about these characters that often, nor do I really like ever want to, but like I don't get to talk about a Rodney or a Beardo or a Leonard or a Stacy. Like, these are characters I don't really ever work with or have the chance to talk about, so I guess it's kind of nice to get my thoughts out on them because they're something. Anyways, thanks for watching this first part. Second part will be out very soon. Bye.